Joined by Andy Herrmann in Boston. He's a partner at Hardesty Hanover Consulting Engineers. He's also a former president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thank you for joining us, Andy. The Amtrak crash earlier this month. Good to have you. So as I mentioned, the Amtrak crash earlier this month is drawing congressional attention to infrastructure spending, but the call for spending is really nothing new. President Obama has long been pushing for it. At this point, is it even debatable as to whether we need to spend on updating our infrastructure?
Is not really debatable anymore. The American Society of Civil Engineers has come out with its report card. Latest one was 2013. We looked at 16 categories of infrastructure. We had 11 Ds, 4 Cs, and only 1 B. The overall grade point was a D+. That's not very good for our infrastructure in the United States.
Now, as I mentioned, the U.S. only spends Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to use bridges as an example. Right now in the United States, bridges, we have about 11% are considered structurally deficient, another 14% functionally obsolete. The average age of our bridges is 42 years old, and when they were designed, they probably were designed for a lifespan of 50 years. So we're not maintaining, we're not rehabilitating, we're not putting that investment forward to get our bridges up to a higher grade and a better capacity.
Which many people can attest to if you drive through the streets of the United States. Now, the U.S. only spends 1.7% of its GDP on infrastructure. That's a 20-year low. How has the underfunding of our infrastructure impacted the U.S. economy?
Well, the American Society of Civil Engineers did put forth an economic study. We hired some people to put together a series of studies called the Failure to Act. And basically what they did is they looked at what happens if we go to 2020 and we only invest the same as we've been investing all along for the last 5 or 10 years. What would happen to the American public, to businesses, to the GDP? And it's very scary. It would hit our American businesses by 2020 to the tune of $430 billion. We're looking at a GDP hit of almost $900 billion. If you get down to the family level, it's over $1,000 a year for a family if we just keep investing at the same level. And the big one is the loss of jobs. We're looking at about 700 to 800,000 losses of jobs by 2020.
Okay, well, at the same time, it's interesting because voters largely support infrastructure spending. Why hasn't anything been done if we know our roads are in dire need of an upgrade? And it seems that we've got also the will of the public that's behind it. Why aren't politicians following through and actually doing something about it?
We have a lot of inertia right now in Congress. We have a lack of leadership, and we have a lack of political courage. There is a need for this. The politicians speak about it all the time, the need to improve the infrastructure, but they don't have the will to get the funding mechanisms to improve it.
Okay, and in terms of funding, though, the American Society of Civil Engineers says there's a $1.6 trillion infrastructure funding gap between now and 2020. Where do you think the money should come from?
Well, basically, it should come from user fees. The people who use the various categories of infrastructure should be paying for them, paying as we go. In the past, we did that with the Highway Trust Fund, which was the gas tax. But there are other ways. There are sales taxes. There are tolls on bridges or roads. They're all turn out to be user fees.
Now, Andy, you mentioned the Highway Trust Fund. That's which finances our roads, bridges, and public transit. Now, it's about to run out of money, and it is reliant upon the federal gas tax for funding. We haven't raised that federal gas tax in 22 years, yet gas prices are very low right now. Isn't now the time we do that? And is this part of the reason why we find ourselves in this situation because we haven't raised that gas tax? Is that the culprit?
That's the culprit for transportation. The last time we had a raise in the gas tax was probably 1992, 22 years ago. Just inflation is killing us. We just don't have the amount of spending that we had in 1992 that we have now in 2014 and 2015. We have that lack of funding, which is hurting us. And if you go back to the last highway bill, the long-term one, which provided funding for a number of years, 6 years, since that point, its expiration, we've had 33 short-term extensions of the highway bill. The departments of transportation can't work with a 2, 4, or 6 month extension. And we just got another 2-month one. It's hard for them to do long-term planning, which is what you have to do for infrastructure.